Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades. Welcome to African History Club. This is now episode number 49. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. Today, I would like to speak about the recent coup d'etat in Burkina Faso. The Burkina Faso, which was once led by the great Thomas Sankara. At the beginning of the pandemic, I made a short series of video recordings, and I called them the Coronavirus Diaries. And in one episode, I said that many African countries, the governments in many African countries, would not survive the impact of the pandemic, the stress that it would put on their economies while demand grows, population grows, would put them in a very difficult position because most of them do not have self-sustaining economies. They depend disproportionately compared to industrialized countries, for example, to the revenue from exports of primary commodities. So obviously, the pandemic has had impact on the production of agricultural commodities and the demand for the imports from the industrialized countries also diminished because of restriction of economic activity in the industrialized countries, in the center, so to speak. So the periphery, of course, was going to suffer the consequences. And then many of these countries also depend on tourism revenue from tourists coming from the West. And of course, the tourism industry also collapsed as a result of the pandemic. So I said, I think it would be impossible for many of these governments to survive. So that is, of course, one of the underlying factors that has put significant stress on African countries, generally speaking. But then, of course, there are issues that impact particular countries in a different way. And then there are issues that also impact regional countries in a certain way. So you will notice that in all the coverage of these series of coups in African countries, particularly in West Africa and in Central Africa, there's no mention of something which is very significant in explaining why these takeovers by the military are occurring at this particular time and beginning at a particular time, with the first one in recent years being the one in Mali in 2012. What had occurred shortly before that, rather? The destruction of the Libyan government under Muammar Gaddafi by the United States and NATO. The destruction of the Libyan government unleashed vast quantities of sophisticated weapons to all assorted militias in the region, in North Africa, as well as in Western Africa. So these weapons have been playing a very significant role in the conflicts that have led up to these coups. So, for example, in Mali, the government there found itself fighting against tremendously armed militias or militants, what have you, In many of the corporate media, you hear the term Islamist to describe them. I really don't know what that means, you know, because when you put it in that context, it implies that somehow it is because of Islamic faith that somebody's carrying out acts of violence. And I think that's a very simplistic way of putting it. And you know, I don't use that term personally. So, for lack of a better term, let's call them militias. Very well armed, fighting the government in Mali. And the army in Mali basically being overwhelmed, not being able to defeat these militias who were actually gaining ground in Mali. So the first coup in 2012 was a coup of desperation, I call it. And that's actually very similar to the one that just happened in Burkina Faso. So I'll come back to Burkina Faso shortly. So in Mali, the army overthrew the government. I think the leader was Amadou Sanogo, who was also trained in the United States. And I'll deal with that issue of U.S. training shortly. It is important, but it's not that significant, as I will argue. So he overthrows the government, and then the French escalate their participation in assisting the military government in fighting these militants, these militias that had invaded Mali, pushing in from the north. French sent a lot of their air forces, their commandos and paratroopers, together with an assortment of other West African countries as fighting in a coalition. And then eventually, the country returned to civilian administration, only until 2020, when there was another coup d'etat, this time led by a colonel named Assimi Goïta, who overthrew Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, who was the civilian president. And in all these coups d'etats, of course, there's French approval in the background, because all those governments, whether it's the civilian or the military, are absolutely dependent on the French. So that was the Mali coup. And the part that was left out in the analysis or presentation in the corporate media was that France was, in essence, helping to put out a raging fire that France had helped to instigate. France, under Sarkozy, Nicolas Sarkozy, the president of France at that time, during the conflict with Libya, had been the leading, most aggressive in pushing for the war against Libya, this war of aggression that unleashed all these weapons and then sparked all these conflicts. And France is now claiming that it was coming to the rescue of Mali, when in fact the people of Mali would not be in those conditions had France not helped to destroy the Libyan state. And one way to understand it is that most of those countries border each other. You know, they're either within the same region or they share borders. You know, the regional countries are Guinea, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad. And then in the case of Chad and Niger, they share the border with Libya. And then Niger borders Chad and Mali and Burkina Faso and Benin and Nigeria. So these weapons were just moving from one country to the other. And that's why even in Nigeria, which is a bit farther from the epicenter of the conflict emanating from the destroyed Libyan state, was also experiencing its own challenges with Boko Haram, which also became equipped with these sophisticated weapons and were able to escalate their attacks against the Nigerian state. So that is the factor that you will not find discussed in any of the corporate media, and that is not surprising because, after all, they are the mouthpieces of the corporate establishment, the Western establishment, the corporatocracy that runs these countries. So in Burkina Faso, sadly, we have a similar situation. The country, the military, fighting against these equally well-equipped, sophisticated weapons, with the militias with all these weapons, who actually have better weapons than the national armies in many of these countries in the region. And they basically have been losing the battles. Most of the soldiers are confined to their garrisons, not able to protect the population. 1.5 million people displaced from their homes, meaning production is also affected, including of agriculture. So you have now even hunger becoming a factor. More than 1,000 schools closed. So essentially the state is not being able to deliver socially, economically, and certainly in terms of the military confrontation with the militants. Well-armed, thank you to the United States, France, and all the NATO countries that destroyed Libya. So the military is becoming desperate. The officer who took power, Paul-Henri Damiba, overthrowing Roch Kabore. The coup was between January 23rd to the 25th. Had recently insisted that the president, the civilian president, should invite the Russians to come and intervene and help them. And this is beginning to become a pattern now, because they know that, not only is France a dominating colonial power, but this domineering power is not able to help them defeat these militants. And they wonder whether it's by design, and it really could be, because when you have weak states that are absolutely dependent on the French armed forces, which then has garrisons in those countries, it means they also control the politics and the economic production in these countries. But now, somehow they're hoping that Russian imperialism is going to be slightly or in any form better than French imperialism. That, of course, is nothing that is credible at all. But it just shows you the level and condition of desperation from which many of these countries now operate. And it also shows you the level of dysfunction in many African countries, that they would not say, let's try to get sisterly or brotherly African countries to help us with this conflict, but let's go to Russia. Let's run to another overseas or European country to have Europeans come to help us contain this military conflict. But to me, the essential thing is that the state has really failed to deliver. in African countries. I see the military as part of the elite in these African countries. So you have the civilian elite trading power with the military elite, and the people are left out of this equation, right? Walter Rodney really put it best when he said political independence was revolutionary for Africa, for African countries, for the Caribbean, and the domination and formal colonialism from the European powers. But he said that was not an end in of itself. That was actually now giving you the opportunity to transform your societies, transform your production, take control of your destiny, and control your economies, and build domestic economies that are relatively self-contained. And then you engage with the rest of the world. But you don't rely primarily by remaining a periphery country, selling raw materials to the outside world. The price of those raw materials always swings wildly. It could go up, it could go down, because it's always dependent on how much of it that the center wants to buy from you, and that's not how you can actually develop a country. And then on the other hand, you have no control over what you import, the manufactured products. So while their prices keep appreciating, the price of what you sell, either jumps up temporarily, then goes back down, but is never steady. You cannot develop a country like that. You can develop only when you primarily produce what you consume, and you consume what you produce. And then you engage with the rest of the world with some mutual understanding, but not in a position where you are absolutely exploited. And then, as I said, at the beginning of this pandemic, I said many of these governments would not survive. And the military coups in these countries, I've had another episode of this podcast where I refer to them as useless coups. And how do I mean by that? I mean that they're coups that will not essentially transform the society. So you have men in uniform intervening for as long as they can, and then handing over power to men in suits and ties who fail to transform the economy significantly, and eventually you have another intervention by the men in uniform. So even though there had been a period where we did not see these coups d'etats in rapid succession, and of course, I've given you some of the reasons why we're seeing them now in rapid succession. But even in the absence of coups, it doesn't mean we had democracy in these countries. Democracy does not mean wearing a suit and tie. No. You have to be able to transform the country, to transform the lives of your citizens. And let me give you an example of transformative coups in African countries. The 1954 military coup by Gamal Abdel Nasser and his colleagues in the military that got rid of the monarchy, very corrupt monarchy, and introduced a socialist government in Egypt. Very progressive, very enlightened, land redistribution, increase in production, a very prominent foreign policy, had a Pan-African and a Pan-Arab vision as well, and significantly transformed the Egyptian society. And then, of course, we had Jerry Rawlings in Ghana intervene at a time when Ghana was collapsing, the economy was in shambles, and he managed to institute a new constitution that has transformed Ghana into one of the more stable African countries with regular peaceful transition of civilian administration. Not as progressive as Nasser was, but he was also operating at a very different time in history and faced perhaps much more challenges than Nasser had faced. But even his detractors, would be difficult for them to deny that Jerry Rawlings, with an intervention in 1979 and then 1981, significantly transformed Ghana. And then, of course, we have Burkina Faso and Thomas Sankara's intervention in 1983. And that was the most productive phase in the history of Burkina Faso, which had been Upper Volta. And he started by changing the name, saying, what does this neo-colonial name mean? We are now Burkina Faso, the land of the righteous or upright people, and changed their mindset. And his mantra was, let's produce what we consume and consume what we produce. And really push toward breaking off this neo-colonial dependency to the center. The country became self-sufficient in food production. The country built clinics, built schools. Women were empowered with meaningful, real jobs. Women were recruited and trained in the armed forces. The armed forces received political instruction in their responsibilities and obligations to the citizenry. The citizens were trained in militias so that they could protect their communities as well, attacking desertification by building millions of trees. Now, this was a transformative intervention. And then finally engaged the West and invited other African leaders to join in renouncing the foreign debt that has failed, that has held back African countries from being able to develop by eating up the resources they produce in interest payments just to service the debt alone. And that, of course, was the major reason why he was assassinated by his so-called right-hand man, Blaise Compaoré, at the behest of French neo-colonial interest. And then, of course, Compaoré was in power for 27 years, sustained and supported by French neocolonialism until 2014, when he tried to tinker with the Constitution so he could even extend his rule beyond the 27 years. And the people of Burkina Faso came and drove him out of power in a popular revolution. And there was an attempted pushback by the military that tried to disrupt the transition towards civilian rule. But the people once again came out to the streets and pushed these remaining loyalists to Compaoré. And many of them ended up being arrested, these officers who were trying to restore the corrupt legacy of Compaoré. And then they transitioned to civilian rule. And Roch Kabore was elected president in 2015. Now, you have a civilian president, but you don't have a president of the nature of a Thomas Sankara. So Thomas Sankara was actually much more of a Democrat or democratic than this civilian leader. And what do I mean by that? Yes, Sankara came from the military, but Sankara transformed the society by taking government to the people and letting people become a part of government with local councils and administration all over the country, where people participated in guiding the national destiny. So that was very different. So I imagine, for example, if Sankara were alive today and had been the president of Burkina Faso, the conflict with these invading militants would not have degenerated to this level, because he would be able to mobilize the population into a national resistance to protect their communities, protect their families, protect their commodities, protect their farms, and throw out this intervention. But the civilian administration has not been able to do that, and as a result, it's been devastating. As I said, more than 1.5 million people displaced, tens of thousands of people killed, and even students not being able to go to school, and food production has collapsed. So you can see the tremendous pressure that the president was dealing with. And then on the other hand, you can see the tremendous pressure that the military was also dealing with in trying to fight these very well-equipped and armed militants. So the coup was actually not surprising. And now they run to Russia. Russia, in recent years, has escalated its presence and intervention in African countries, particularly in the Central African Republic. And it is essentially protecting the civilian government in that country, which had also been fighting against militants. And it's primarily through a private company called the Wagner Group, which includes many Russian mercenaries, people that used to be in the regular Russian military. And things are so desperate that the military in Burkina Faso sees that as a viable option, and are actually now inviting the Russians to come to help them contain this attack from the militants. But of course, the only way you can succeed is by mobilizing your own population. So the fact that the first thing that these new military rulers are doing is to invite Russia as their savior, that reveals a lot about their mindset and their vision for Burkina Faso. I don't think they'll shock me and turn out to be like Thomas Sankara. Could you imagine Thomas Sankara inviting some Europeans to come and help him contain no matter what type of crisis it was? Absolutely not. So to me, I categorize this, as I previously said, as another one of those useless coups in African countries. So I want to end on a relatively hopeful note. Something is happening at the same time in many African countries. The continent is made up of young people. In Uganda, for example, 80% of the population under the age of 35. Just think about that. Median age on the continent, 26, you know? So it's a very young continent. And the young people have had enough and they're very restless. So, for example, in Mali, last Saturday, there was a global protest in front of all the Malian embassies and foreign missions overseas, organized by young people in Mali to kick out the domineering French influence. In Senegal, the young people started a campaign to end the dependency of the West African currencies to the domination of France, their currency being controlled by the French central bank. And they made significant headway in that campaign. And they were attacking the signs of French commercial and financial imperialism in countries like Senegal, going after French business establishments that monopolize the economies in a cahoots with their so-called African civilian presidents. So I think over a period, we're going to see significant transformation in African countries, which is something I said anyway when I spoke about the pandemic in the series of videos I put out called the Coronavirus Diaries. That's what I called it. And I imagine that we are going to go through a period of relative chaos as we see some of these upheavals. But at the end of the day, I believe that the youth in Africa are going to push out both the civilian elite as well as the military elite, who are two sides of the same coin. And that we will have a situation where young people start taking their destiny into their own hands and becoming a part of government in African countries, fulfilling the vision that a person like Thomas Sankara had for Burkina Faso and for the rest of Africa. He was a Pan-African, and he is well known and beloved up to date by young people in African countries. Decades after his death, after his assassination in 1987, young people who were not yet born at that time, but they know of him and his legacy and what he had tried to do. They know of Patrice Lumumba and what he tried to do in the Congo and how he was assassinated by the West, the US, Britain, and France. They know of Kwame Nkrumah, what the vision of a United States of Africa as the only way that Africans would be able to protect their resources from neo-colonial imperial powers, which in essence is the challenge that African countries are still dealing with today, the failure to transform the state. So hopefully this today's presentation will offer, or was able to offer you, some of the analysis that you will not gain from the corporate media, which are vested in the vision and agenda of imperialism in Africa. So thank you so much, and I will see you in the next podcast. Peace and blessings.